Welcome to the Nostalgia Podcast with me, Sebastian Morello, and my friend Brian Scarffe. Hello, Brian.
Morning, Sebastian. I'm interested in our subject today, partly because we've never really discussed it in depth. But it seems to me.
Well, hold on. To be fair, we did write, we did co-author together an essay for the European Conservative on exactly this topic, so it's not totally virgin territory to us.
No, absolutely. But that was done without discussion and just sort of writing past between each other, which I think has a very different flavour to how the thought develops. And of course, our subject is sacred ecology, which immediately brings in my mind all of the things that we're interested from very seemingly unrelated categories such as Neoplatonism, hunting, farming, and Mariology all into one.
Well, yeah, so it's a weird thing. As you know, my life really, from childhood, has been bound up with the countryside and with rural activities, with hunting and shooting, and all the things from which I derive enormous pleasure. But what this has done is it's meant that I've been connected with the land, and I've acquired experientially and through talking to landowners and tenant farmers and all the people with whom country pursuits are bound up, and I've got a sense of our countryside and what has happened to it. I mean, a lot of people don't know that, for example, in the last 80 years, our over 50% of our ancient forests and woodlands have disappeared. A lot of people don't know that our topsoil is now so depleted because of our use of fungicides and herbicides and pesticides that we are having to import tons and tons of topsoil into the country from Romania and Moldova and places where they haven't done this, where they don't, I mean, in Romania, where my wife is from, they don't even have a word for organic food. They just call it food, right? Our topsoil is now so depleted that it's probably only got fewer than 10 harvests left. We talk incessantly about environmentalism and ecological welfare, but the fact is, at least in this country, which is so unique in terms of habitats and an ancient rural landscape, actually the country from an ecological perspective is incredibly unwell. And what I think is interesting is this ties in a way that it's not tied to this in the public common debate, but we think it needs to be. It ties into questions of Neoplatonic metaphysics, on the iconography of the cosmos and of our world, and how it relates to its creator, from whom it is an emanation and in whose existence it participates. And it ties into a spirituality of stewardship. And it seems to me, and I'll just to sort of finish introducing the topic, as it were, it seems to me that because of the whole green debate has been, apart from a few rare exceptions like Roger Scruton and Paul Kingsnorth, really the whole green debate has been completely appropriated and colonized by globalists who posture as green warriors when they're actually the exact reverse. And so the theocentrism of the green movement has largely disappeared, and it needs to be won back, and it needs to be won back through a rigorous spirituality of stewardship. So that's it seems to me that's where we're going with the topic. But you do add to what I've said, Brian.
I'd like to wind back to the beginning for the sake of the listener, because we often talk about Neoplatonism, but I think it would be helpful both for this episode and for future episodes if you could give a really clear overview of what we mean when we say Neoplatonism, perhaps contrasting it with the alternative or one of the common alternatives. I think that would be really helpful to lay the ground.
Yes, Brian, I'd be happy to do that. Obviously, everything that we mean by Neoplatonic metaphysics or Christian Neoplatonism will likely be developed and teased out in the ensuing episodes that we do together. But just to introduce the topic, I'll say a couple of words about it. The main thing to grasp is that in the classical tradition, the whole of creation is understood to be composed of substances. And substances, if you like, this is just a term for things. In creation, there are things. And there are two things to say about each given thing. That, one, everything exists, and two, everything exists as something. So here you have two principles, essence and existence. What the thing is and that the thing is. And these two principles are the fundamental, basic, elementary principles that account for the reality of any given thing in the world. Now, that observation, which is the most foundational observation that probably one can have, when a child wanders about in the world, the child is saying, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" and pointing at things. What is the child doing? The child is essentially identifying that something is, identifying the existence of something, and then making a request to learn the essence of the thing. So that's the most basic observation that one can make at a metaphysical level, it seems to me. But it's also the fact that everything exists, and the fact that everything exists as something, is also the basic ontology for all of the kind of things that we want to say about sacred ecology and how we want to defend our view of sacred ecology. Because these two principles of essence and existence are clearly irreducible to each other. My dog is currently sleeping next to me here, so let me take dogs as an example, which is in any case the sort of classic example that philosophers like to use. There is nothing about the essence of a dog's dogness, if you like, that tells us that it has to have existed. There's nothing about it's perfectly possible, for example, to conceive of a universe in which dogs didn't exist at all. It's also perfectly possible to conceive of creatures that do not exist, right? Mythical creatures, hippogriffs, for example. Now, that means that every contingent, that is to say, every essence, is contingent, it is unnecessary, it need not have existed, and therefore there is nothing about the essence of anything that we encounter in the world that explains its existence. At the same time, given that none of these things had to have existed, the fact that they exist is not explained by their own existence. So these two principles of essence and existence do not explain themselves, and nor do they explain each other. So they are irreducible to each other. And when you have two metaphysical principles that are irreducible to each other, you have not merely a conceptual distinction, you have a real distinction. Every creature is not simply, it's not simply that we think of it in this way, every creature is, in and of itself, composed at the most basic level of these two principles of essence and existence, neither of which explain themselves, nor are they irreducible to each other. Now, given that they do not explain themselves and do not explain each other, what does explain existence, and what does explain the fact that things exist as the things they are? Particularly given that you seem to have these essences that when they manifest before us in given instantiations, so when dogness manifests itself as this dog asleep next to me, the instantiation of the essence doesn't seem to possess within itself everything entailed by the essence. And this is quite obvious when you go and walk your dog at the park, and when my whippet, that's basically like a small greyhound, is standing next to, I don't know, a bull mastiff or a French bulldog, they look so dissimilar that they could be completely different species, and yet even a toddler can immediately apprehend that he's dealing with two instances of the same essence, that dogness inheres in both the French bulldog and the whippet. So what explains this essence, and where do we locate this essence? Well, the classical tradition that has incorporated the Platonic and Aristotelian worldviews and combined them in this rich Neoplatonic metaphysics, which it then baptized through the Church Fathers and so on, has located the realm of essences in the mind of God as what are called the divine ideas. So the universe has intelligibility, and it has intelligibility because it emanates from the mind of God, or it participates in the essences that are the divine ideas. And it's the fact that the universe is comprised of these essences that are instantiated in the great realm of objects with which we're surrounded, that it is intelligible. And its intelligibility is not derived from its existence, but from these essences, which is why when we want to understand something, know something, when we want to render the world intelligible, we point and we say, what's that? When we say, oh, I can see something through the trees there, but I don't know what it is, we are saying we recognize that it is possible to identify the existence of something without knowing the essence of it. So again, we have these two irreducible principles. Now, this is what Aquinas refers to as the dual exemplarism of all contingent beings. And it's the dual exemplarism because in order for a contingent being to exist, it must receive its existence or participate in the existence of that requires no further explanation for its existence. And therefore non-contingent being is the prerequisite for contingent being. And so you need something that doesn't merely have existence, but actually is existence, whose essence is existence. And you also need something that that provides the genus essences and the species essences in which the things of our apprehension must participate or emanate forth from that in order for them to be intelligible. And so a being, or you need, rather more properly said, you need being whose essence is existence. Now what this means is that the whole universe is unfolding out of the Godhead. The whole universe is the great iconography of the Godhead. This is this is the kind of Sophianic, hermetic vision of the cosmos that this podcast basically exists, I think, to convey. And I suppose I should just say something about the iconography metaphor. Whilst I think it's a helpful metaphor, the great limitation for this metaphor is that if an iconographer creates an icon and he dies, the icon will continue to exist. So it might lend itself to a kind of deistic view of the relationship between creator and creation. And actually the Neoplatonic view is kind of the opposite of that. The Neoplatonic view is that for anything to exist, given that nothing at any moment explains its own existence, nor does its existence explain the fact that it exists as the thing it is, explains why it has that essence, every single thing that exists only exists insofar as it is at all times participating in the existence of God, who bestows upon it its created contingent existence. And it exists as the kind of thing it does because God, from his divine ideas, is thinking of it and willing it into being at every given moment of its being. Right? And so, in that sense, the universe is much more like divine music. If the singer stops singing, the music just stops. If God were for one moment to stop loving and willing the universe into existence, the universe would just stop. He's not going to do that because that would be contrary to the divine wisdom. He's brought it into being for love of it. But the point is that it is reliant on him for its reality at every given moment. And so that's the kind of vision of the universe as this great communication of the Godhead that this podcast exists to initiate people into. And those who see the world in that way, who have broken out of the materialism and reductionism of modernity, are the people who see the world as it truly is. I hope that's helpful, but no doubt we will continue to tease out everything entailed by Neoplatonism, Neoplatonic metaphysics, Christian Neoplatonism, as we continue our conversations. Is that what you were looking for, Brian?
No, I think that's very helpful. The relationship between the creator and the created has, in the Neoplatonic tradition, been described as emanation. But in the contemporary church atmosphere, emanation is quite a controversial description, leading to accusations of pantheism. I remember I recently had a conversation with a priest who got rather upset when I offhandedly used the term emanation to describe creation, and wasn't entirely comfortable when I pointed out that this was language used by the doctors of the church, such as Albert the Great and others. In fact,
Thomas Aquinas. And
Thomas Aquinas
uses the term.
Albert the Great, I think, writes a piece specifically on how emanation is actually a challenge to pantheism, in fact, the only challenge to pantheism. And I'm not going to detail his argument here, but could you go more into that? Why is emanation so controversial today, and what has replaced it as the dominant mindset? Because it's not quite sort of the extreme form of deism, but it's something in that direction.
Yeah. Emanation. Emanation simply means that something springs forth from something else, right? And so I'm currently speaking to you right now, and my speech is emanating forth from me. And my speech is a creation of me. I am creating my speech at the moment. My speech is not me, but it conveys me. It communicates what is going on within me to you, and it emanates forth from me. Interestingly enough, we talked about the metaphor of the iconographer and the metaphor of the musician in order to understand creation. The metaphor that Thomas Aquinas uses in the Summa Contra Gentiles is to explain the relationship between creator and creation, is the metaphor of the speaker. And bearing in mind that he belonged to the order of preachers, you can understand why that was a metaphor that seemed obvious to him. And so that it's a wonderful passage. I actually recreate the whole thing in the world as God's icon and comment on it. And one of the things that Aquinas says is, in order to convey God's own goodness to that rational part of creation that could apprehend his goodness, namely us, it wasn't fitting that God just create one thing, which he could have done, but just as for me to express the goodness of the saints or the goodness of the Lord or whatever, I need many words available to me in order to just even give a shadow of that goodness. So God, in conveying himself, had to create many words, right? And those words are the stars, the planets, the animals, the trees, the rivers, everything, the whole universe. Each is a word of God spoken through the eternal word, the Logos, into creation, so that the entire universe might convey something of his goodness, right? Now that's classic emanation metaphysics. And so what I say is that the fundamental ontology that the church's theology has pre-required is Neoplatonic participation emanation metaphysics. All creation emanates from God in order to convey his goodness, and all creation participates in the existence of God in order to exist, right? And this metaphysics was taken up by the church fathers, Saint Augustine, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Irenaeus, Saint Athanasius. All of these were Neoplatonic thinkers. There's this ridiculous myth in the historiography of the ecclesiastical institution that sometime in the 13th century the church rejected Neoplatonism and became Aristotelian. That's just simply not true. Aquinas was absolutely committed to a Neoplatonic ontology, as were his, many his contemporaries that are now great doctors of the church, like Bonaventure, for example. And then, of course, in the 16th century, you have people like Nicholas of Cusa, Pico della Mirandola, Marsilio Ficino, all of whom are Neoplatonic thinkers. A classical realist Neoplatonism is the ontology of traditional Christianity. Now, the big problem that we have is because of this myth of an Aristotelian revolution. You get a lot of low-grade seminary manuals that opt for a highly crude form of Aristotelianism transposed into the church's theology. And what this leads to, although many of these, novice masters and so on who wrote these seminary manuals would be horrified to learn this, what this means is a kind of veiled or tacit deism enters the church, so that most people now think of the relationship between uh, between creator and creation not as something like music or speech or iconography or the kind of metaphors to which we've been alluding, but they think of it as much more like the relationship between uh, a blacksmith and a horseshoe, right? That God makes this thing, and that's his creation, and whatever the relation is between what he's arbitrarily made and himself remains obscure, right? And of course, once Protestantism comes along, and Protestantism completely denies that nature itself is a source of revelation, right? So traditional Christianity has always said that there are two books of revelation, right? There's nature, there's the book of nature, and there's the book of Holy Writ, right? And so
And it
these
was
are
also said by many of the fathers that had the fall not happened, the book of nature would have been as clear as the book of Revelation and would have been all that was needed to know God.
yes, absolutely. And also, whilst most of the doctors of the church recognise that had there been no fall, the second person of the Holy Trinity still would have incarnated, because the kind of intimacy that God desires with his own creature requires personal presence. So for the great teachers of our tradition, the the remarkable thing, the astounding thing, is not that God incarnated. Of course God would incarnate because he wants to be personally present among us, because he loves us. The remarkable thing is not that he incarnated, it's that he incarnated despite the fall. He incarnated despite our rejection of him, and he nonetheless entered history, and he made his incarnation, which he always intended, the very means by which to allow those he loved to kill him, and therefore enter into the depths of their sin, and then break out of that through his resurrection and unite them to himself. That's what's really astounding, that even after our great betrayal of him in the cosmic mystery, he comes searching for us in order to kind of court us and coax us back into this spousal bridal relationship with him. So that's the anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. The point is, that's really important to understand here, is that slowly, since the 16th century in particular, and then through the kind of philosophy of the 18th century and so on, we have incrementally adopted deist ways of thinking about how God relates to creation, and and if you like, by doing that, we have allowed modernity to colonize our minds, which is kind of the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is to say everything about modernity, right? Everything about modernity, and if you're listening to this and say, oh well, what you want to get rid of your laptop and your microphone and the things that are allowing you to do your podcast, and you want to get rid of your smartphones? No, that's not what we're saying. And part of the problem with this whole conversation is that people who haven't thought long enough have repeatedly conflated moral and spiritual progress with technological innovation, and that is a very great mistake. We are talking about modernity as a historiography of moral and spiritual progress and the emancipation of the individual as some great thing, which has actually just killed meaning and purpose in our lives. And the point of this podcast is to repudiate the entire trajectory of that progress theology of modernity and to replace it with an initiatory path into our genuine tradition. And that's what we're all talking about. That's what Brian and I are into.
So the practical effects of what you're talking about means that contemporary man views the world as an accumulation of resources, and as man as a consumer who moves through the world taking up resources and refashioning them into utilitarian contraptions, rather than as an interpretive agent who moves through an allegory that is unfolding before him, which through contemplation allows one to enter into an intimacy with the speaker. And so when we get enthusiastic about the natural world, that's what we're trying to indicate. And it's quite a hard thing to talk about because it almost requires an indirect approach, because as the greatest truths can't be explicitly spoken about, they have to be approached in a circular, indirect fashion. So walking.
Well, Brian, one of the things to say about this, just briefly, my apologies. I know I've kind of gone on a bit too long on a few topics, but I think you were right to say they needed to be covered. But I think one of the big problems we have at the moment is that anthropology that you just described of man as a kind of atomized producer and consumer, those who have completely appropriated the ecology debate, they say, well, we can't treat the world like this because the world is a very precious resource, right? And so they transpose the question of ecological welfare into market terms, right? And what happens is that we all get worried because we think that we're not treating this precious resource properly, or we're being greedy about it, or whatever. And we get sucked into that discussion, and then those who implicitly intuit that actually the world is something way more mysterious and wonderful and glorious than a mere resource to be treated with prudence by consumers, what they do is they then are so scandalized by the initial response to our ecological crisis that they then say, oh no, what we really need to do is just get away from the world. We need to just rewild the whole world. We need to pen ourselves up in urban 15-minute cities. We need to have nothing to do with the natural world. We need to completely sever ourselves from the natural world. And actually, if we can recreate ourselves as avatars in a virtual world and kind of escape the natural arena altogether and no longer act as a kind of cancerous virus within the natural world, then we can liberate the natural world from our malign presence. And now what we do is we just oscillate constantly in the so-called green debate. We oscillate constantly between these two positions of either seeing the world in market terms, or them being so disgusted by seeing the world in market terms that we want to basically commit demographic suicide and for those who remain, kind of sever any link with the natural world, of which, by the way, we are an inextricable part, and with which we are totally contiguous. And because we oscillate between these two stupidities, we can't have a proper conversation anymore about how we actually relate to the world that is our home. And the only way that we can do that, and this is what Christians need to understand, rather than saying, oh, the green movement, the green conversation, that's got nothing to do with us. That's some weird globalist agenda of the elites. We're not part of that. What they need to realize is that actually those who stand in the Christian tradition have the only means, the only resources to approach the world properly as the great iconography of the Godhead, as something sacred and holy, uh, albeit marred by sin and under the legal jurisdiction of Satan, and must be baptized and recovered and offered back to the kingdom of Christ. Of course, all of that, but it has a sacrality of its own by virtue of participating in God. And that's the point. And only a theocentric conception of the world will actually afford you that vision. Sorry to interrupt there, Brian.
No, not at all. It springs to mind that the current proposals that are in opposition to the capitalist and materialist paradigm lack in imagination and ambition. They sort of fall into the despairing anthropology of man as being incapable of doing anything other than abusing the cosmos. I think the relationship between a man and a woman is very illuminating in how we can picture the situation. What you essentially have is a man whose wife has basically become a slave, and he mistreats this woman who is essentially his slave. And all the villagers come around and try and talk to the man and say, well, you need to start treating your slave a little bit better, rather than stepping back and saying, actually, this woman isn't supposed to be a slave at all and should be the object of veneration, and is an instantiation of something really profound. And this is not just sort of my fancy. This is in the Old Testament, the Song of Solomon is the most mystical love story between man and God, as God pursues mankind, and that's given it using the picture of a relationship between a man and a woman. The great school of Chartres used perhaps the highest form of feminine imagery for the natural world, and used a kind of allegorical goddess figure called Natura to describe the functions of the natural world, but particularly as somebody. This allegorical figure was understood as the Vicaria Dei, the vicar of God, as a midwife who tended to God's creation as she listened to the Logos. So this feminine imagery, also I suppose in much simpler forms of poetry, and people understand the flowering of spring and the flourishing of greenery in very feminine terms. And so it seems very closely linked into our huge failure of the relationship between the sexes. The men aren't really men anymore, and sort of the attempt to re-masculinize men just seems to produce abusive brutes, and women are becoming more masculine, and there's an ever-increasing dissatisfaction with the natural functions of the woman's body, of a woman's body to give birth, to be fertile. All of this disjointed relationship between men and women seems to match almost perfectly to the disjointed relationship between man and nature.
Well, a massive aspect of the Christian spiritual path is the integration of the masculine and the feminine in every single one of us. I don't like it when I hear people say, you know, a child of God or a son and daughter of God when referring to the sexes respectively, because it's theologically clunky, essentially, because every woman is a son of God, because we are only adopted insofar as we're only adopted by God the Father insofar as we are integrated into the only begotten Son. So every person on earth, insofar as he is baptized or she is baptized, is a son of God. In relation to the Father, we are all male. In relation to the Son, we are all female. We're all brides of Christ. That's what it is to be members of the church, to be part of the mystical bride of Christ, right? In relation to the Spirit, we're all temples. Okay, and it's within that temple, it's in the great theurgical enterprise of the inner sanctum that the feminine bride of Christ and the masculine Son of God are integrated in the spiritual path of the Christian. And so too, from a Christian ecology or a sacred ecology perspective, in relation to the creation as stewards, we are all representatives of the Creator, right? We all have a masculine relationship with the Creator, and one of the effects of original sin is that the man doesn't simply want to lead and protect and provide for the feminine. He wants to dominate and subdue it, right? And so rather than becoming great stewards, we have in modernity become the great slave owners, right? As you were saying. So this is a perversion of the masculine charism of the steward, who in relation to creation is always masculine. But as creatures who are contiguous with creation, we're all feminine. We're all feminine in our relationship with God, because God has brought forth the creation as a kind of superabundance of the love that already exists in the Trinity, so that he can have a spousal relationship with creation, which is why creation is Mother Earth, which is why it is Mother Nature, which is why it is the great Magna Mater, which I think we should talk about perhaps when we discuss this further. But the point is that the whole of creation, the dance of the great cosmic spheres, the bird song, the growing of the great oaks, the whole of creation is a liturgy. It's a bridal liturgy to the Creator, right? And that is redeemed and perfected in the church's liturgies, which is why we built cathedrals like Chartres that look like, in a perfectly grace-filled world, they would just erupt spontaneously out of the ground, right? And point up to the Creator in that way. And in fact, this is why the sacred ecology argument is, if you like, the flip side. It's the other side of the coin from the sacred urbanism conversation about how to redeem the urban space. Because what modernity has done is it has taken, if you like, the idea of Chartres Cathedral, the idea of the great Gothic enterprise, and it has perfectly inverted it. So it's leveled everything, it's flattened everything. You go into the kind of Soviet cities of the world, and you see what an atheistic tyranny wants to do. It wants to take the created order that in and of itself always points towards the Creator, and it wants to turn that on its head and completely level it, flatten it, make you think that there is nothing beyond your production and your consumption as a kind of cog in the great machine, as Max Weber put it. And actually it's through getting a proper sense of how Creator and creation relate to one another that not only can we start to retrieve the sacred ecology argument and therefore reappropriate the green conversation, but we can also start to have mature conversations about what a truly redeemed urban space might look like.
Yeah, interesting. I think we'll probably have to discuss the city aspect later because this is obviously of great eschatological importance. The question of the garden and the question of the city as the priesthood of all believers encounter the natural world. There is this twofold process. On the one hand, we are experiencing a direct listening on the broadest sense of the term to the logos as it's instantiated in the natural world. We've as part of a slip towards deism, we assume that God speaks to us when we retreat into our rooms and make things really, really quiet. And I'm not discounting sort of that kind of contemplation, but we've categorized that as the way that God will directly speak to us, either through a Bible, or through being in a very quiet space and trying to filter out your thoughts to find that voice in your head that would be the word of God. But in walking through a wood or through the meadows, spending time in a flower-filled garden, one is listening with the full being if you're in a right relationship to the natural world.
I think that's right, and we've definitely. I think one thing I have slight reservations about with regard to that, though, is that we have developed this view that you can, as they like to say, reconnect with nature by kind of visiting nature as a sort of alien from a distant planet. People now talk about forest bathing, where you sort of go and stand amid some trees and sort of, I suppose, feel good about yourself or something. I don't really know. And obviously I'm a great enthusiast for hiking and spending time outdoors, and I encourage in my own children an outdoorsy approach to things. But what we really need to discover, I think, is not simply visiting nature as some distant wanderer, but participating in its cycle. We need to start growing things again. We need to hunt animals. We need to forage for food. We need to, we need vegetable patches. We need to keep chickens. We really need to start actually entering into nature's cycle as stewards and as contiguous with that cycle.
Right. So I think that's the second part of where I was going, that just as our experience of God's presence in nature is a much deeper and richer form of communication than just mere human language, the way that it affects us is not that we convert it into thoughts that are human words and sort of narrowing it down to the kind of communication that two people engage into, but rather that the incoming of the logos that we experience as we are engaged in nature transforms our actions. So it becomes sort of, I hate how reductionist this sounds, but an input-output. But there's the input of the word through our interface with the natural world as the feminine, as part of creation, and then the way that transforms us in being affects our actions in our masculine element engaging with creation. So it's this continuous continuous interfacing, sort of where we stand in the middle between the higher and the lower worlds, and the inspiration of the logos from the higher worlds comes in, filters through a heart in right orientation, and flows out through our physical abilities and cultivation of that world to grow things, to build things, to tend to the things in the natural world that require intervention for further flourishing. So the purpose is for us as we are out in nature is to increase the fertility and to facilitate the ever further beautification of the feminine outflow of the natural world.
I think that's right, and I think people who don't even have the kind of, they don't share the theocentric worldview that perhaps, they don't share that the same worldview as perhaps you and I do, or if they do, they might not articulate it in quite the same way as you and I might. But those who really participate in a very concrete and practical way in the cosmic cycle of death and regeneration, they at least have some intimation of what we've been talking about. I was reading the other day about the wildfowlers of the English coastline. There are great wildfowling communities in Kent, in Suffolk and Norfolk, in Lincolnshire, and then up in Cumbria, and some smaller communities along the Welsh coasts. Wildfowling is really it's field craft at its purest in a way, because it depends on the migratory patterns of waterfowl. It's there are certain species that must never be shot; they're forbidden quarry, because either they're protected or their numbers are down or whatever it is. And you have to be able to identify those species at very significant distances without a scope or binoculars or anything, because all you've got is a shotgun in your hand. You have to understand the migratory patterns. You have to understand the habitats. You also need, for your own safety, to understand the tides. If you get stranded out there, you will drown. It's very dangerous. It takes a vast amount of knowledge. If you join a wildfowling association, they won't even allow you to go out, on the Wash or in the Broads or anywhere on your own for the first 2 years, just because it is so dangerous. And what a lot of people don't know about wildfowling is that in this country, it has been for way over a century now, deeply connected with some of England's most successful conservation efforts. All of the habitat protection that has gone on along our coasts to protect migratory birds has been connected to wildfowling communities who have seen the industrialisation of our coastlines throughout their lives, and they're terrified at the kind of habitat destruction that it entails. Because if you hunt, what people don't understand is you love your quarry. Right? As a deer stalker, I've just come back from Africa, where I have been hunting big game in the Great Karoo, and the kind of conservation efforts that are going on to assure the future of those species is absolutely astonishing, particularly after 2 centuries of market hunting and aggressive industrialized farming and so on. It's almost like you have seen this conversion experience that's gone on at an ecological level, where people have said, no, we have to move to rotation farming, to regenerative farming. away from intensive and industrialized farming. We have to move away from market hunting to ethical hunting based on keeping the various species at optimum levels and optimal health. And when I go and hunt a deer, and I look at that deer is not merely a kind of manifestation of its species, right? It's not. It is this particular deer, and I have a moral relation with that deer, and I cannot mess up that shot because it's going to haunt me for weeks if I do. I have to get a clean kill. I have to honor that animal. Somebody who simply knows dead animals from encountering them on supermarket shelves does not at least sufficiently experience that moral relation with the created world that the field sporting person does, and I think unless we and I certainly think for Christians there's an imperative to rediscover different ways of participating in a very concrete way in the natural world of which he is, whether he remembers it or not, an intrinsic part. Unless we do that, we're not going to. It's like you said earlier, you can't really approach this topic straight on, right, in kind of watertight rationalistic demonstrations. You have to ease your way into it, and one of the ways of easing your way into it, yes, is having the discussions we're having, but actually doing things, actually entering into, in an existential, experiential way, entering into the cosmic mystery. I have found that very much through hunting and shooting, but that's not the only way. That is certainly not the only way. But in any case, there is a serious imperative for Christians to find some way of doing this, because sacred ecology is part of the spiritual life of the Christian.
I think there's so I've not hunted in the same way that you have, but when I was growing up, I did a lot of fly fishing, which is the closest thing to hunting in the fishing world, where you stalk the fish. You have to learn to read the natural environment, understand what the fish might be doing in certain weather, and discover what the fish would be interested in as a lure. And I think that the relationship between the hunter and the hunted has a very interesting set of pictures which are very potent in what we were talking about, the integration of the masculine and the feminine. So as a hunter, you are engaged in the masculine pursuit. You are doing you are the active agent, hunting the quarry, and that's quite obvious. Perhaps what's less obvious is that as you learn to know your quarry, a very important aspect of knowledge is that the object of your knowledge becomes a part of you, and the spiritual elements of hunting are that as you come to know your quarry, you begin to discover that actually you are the quarry in the greater hunt, and it's the divine huntsman who is hunting you. And so as the masculine agent on the hunt, the more ingrained you become in the life of the quarry, and the more it's taken on, the more you begin to integrate the spiritual aspect of yourself being the quarry. And that this is pictures obviously from a lot of world mythology of the gods hunting man. I think it's a very potent image.
Brian, I have to tell you, one of our favourite authors, John Hannay, the philosopher John Hannay, I don't know if you've come across this, but in his work, The Divine Craftsman, I've just found this amazing quote which speaks precisely to what you were just describing. So this is what he writes in The Divine Craftsman. This is amid, by the way, a meditation that he has on God as hunter, right? And he says the following, quote, "The symbol here expresses the very condition of man and of every creature in the world, a condition in which it is impossible for them in any way to escape God. To become aware of this situation, and perhaps to accept it, can be, moreover, the starting point of the spiritual path, which explains how such a path may sometimes be compared to a hunt, in which the soul is, as it were, being tracked by God, or, inversely, is ardently hunting its prey, Jesus Christ." End quote.
Very interesting. Yes, I'm a great lover of Jean Hany, and that's a fantastic work which I recommend our listeners
Isn't that a
check it
great
out.
quote? Isn't that
Absolutely
just a fantastic
fantastic.
quote?
And it brings to mind the psalm, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you." And this brings a really mysterious element of hunting to the fore. I forget where I read this, but among the Native American Indians, it's often said that when the final moments of the hunt approach and the animal is about to be slain, there appears to be a change in the behavior of the animal, and the animal stops trying to get away and appears to come into some kind of acceptance that it's about something extraordinary is about to happen to it. And the language that's often used describes a kind of self-sacrifice on behalf of the animal, that the animal allows itself to be taken by the hunter, and so that's what springs to mind.
Well, my friend, the sociological philosopher Michael Martin, who is also a very keen deer stalker on his biodynamic farm in rural America, where he hunts whitetail deer. And he talks about an amazing experience of waiting in his hide for a deer, and this buck just appearing out of the mist. And he said it was as if this animal had just presented itself as a kind of cosmic gift on which he and his family would then feed and sustain themselves. And there was this intuition that the appearance of this buck had happened within a universe that was providentialist, or is providentialist. And the appearance of this buck emerging, antlers first, out of the mist, was a mystical experience. And I think it's important because you made a really key point earlier, which I got carried away with something else, and I failed to address, which is that the spiritual life is very often conceived as kind of turning within oneself and kind of recollecting in the inner cloister of one's soul, and that it really has nothing to do with the universe we found ourselves in. And whilst there is rightly a focus on the interior life in Christian spirituality, that all too often, because of it, it's become colonized by Cartesian prejudices and a kind of anthropological dualism, which is alien to the hylomorphic anthropology that Christians subscribe to. It has become disconnected from a true Christian spirituality, which is profoundly incarnational. And the big problem with this is that above anything, people need to realize that when we say that our history is linear and it is moving towards an eschatological climax where there is going to be a unification of heaven and earth and a perfect glorification of earth. It's this earth. It's this earth. It's not a new earth. I mean, when we say a new heaven and a new earth, what we mean is they become new by their conjoining. But it's this earth that is redeemed. This is the earth where the urban-rural dichotomy is going to be overcome by the New Jerusalem, right? It's and God will be perfectly glorified by this earth, and the great spiritual and moral imperative of Christians is to take this earth, which on account of sin is under the legal spiritual jurisdiction of diabolical principalities, and to place it under Jesus Christ's kingdom, his kingship. And you can do this in a micro way, which is, every Christian, his household, his own little territory where his family lives and where his home is, that should be a fiefdom of Christ's kingdom, where Christ is acknowledged as sovereign. But every nation needs, in the end, to come to the wedding feast of the Lamb, as the book of Revelation says. It's the peoples, it's the tribes, it's the nations who gather. It's not the atomized individuals. And every nation must become a fiefdom of Christ's kingdom. And that's not simply finding his kingdom in the inner cloister of your soul. That's literally taking the world and offering it to Jesus Christ. That's why we built great big cathedrals and universities and hospitals and put spires everywhere and completely transformed the landscape and managed the forests and ritualized hunting activity and did all of these things. That's why we created something called Christendom, because we wanted to take the world and we wanted to offer it back to its creator.
And the word offer there is the key word, because this ties together your quote from Jean Hany, where the beginning of the spiritual life is kind of the recognition that you are being stalked by the divine, and the self-sacrifice of quarry that takes place in an authentic hunt. So as we recognize that that's what's happening to us, the initiation into authentic spirituality is to make one's life a self-sacrifice to the divine, an oblation, and exactly the same for the natural world, to make it sacred, to sacrifice it, to transform it into an offering back to God.
That's right, and I think people don't realise that the natural world is not the kind of Disneyland world of Bambi that I think people kind of envisage. The natural world is a place where there is the tearing of flesh, there are insects that want to burrow into you, there are screeching creatures, you look at a stork, for example. A stork is this most glorious animal. His incredible wingspan, the whitest of white feathers, they're just so beautiful. Well, storks don't tend to make their own nests, right? They go in, they only half the time do they make their nests. Most of the time they find the stalks of the nests of other storks, and they massacre the babies in those nests, and they take they take the nests, right? This is what animals do to each other all the time. The natural world is an incredibly scary and violent place because when our first parents sinned, the whole of the cosmos was thrown into disarray as a consequence. And when you go into the beautiful woodlands and forests of Europe, and you think, gosh, how remarkable the natural world is. Well, no, the forests and the woodlands of Europe look the way they do because they have been managed by Christians for 2 millennia, right? That is why the forests and the woodlands of Europe look the way they do, because of the infusion of nature by grace, right, in a very concrete way. This is this is really the great imperative now. The whole green debate that has become so misleading needs to be appropriated by Christians who have a theocentric and therefore true ontology.